Docking request accepted.
Good morning, New Eden. Today is October 14th, 2024, and this is the Federation Frontline Report. I'm your host, Frozen Fallout, and today we are continuing our epic of CSM 19 interviews. Kazanir is here with us today. Thanks for coming on, man. It's such an honor to have you here.
Hey, happy to be here.
Awesome. So tell me, how did you get into EVE Online? Like, when did you first actually take a look at this game, and what got you interested?
All right, well, so there's a little bit of a hidden story, as a matter of fact. The first time I actually tried was in, I think, 2007, maybe even 6, thinking, oh, this is a joystick game. And I happened to be the age where, in the 90s as a kid, my dad was a PC salesman, so we had a couple of computers in the house always, and I played a ton of X-Wing and TIE Fighter as a, preteen teenager. I thought it was a joystick game. Of course, it's not a joystick game at all. And so I didn't connect with it. A small guild of mine, briefly, a WoW guild, went to play that game in that era. I quickly ended up renting in the drone regions of all things. It was with Ethereal Dawn, which was sort of like a pet partner of Intrepid Crossing
Yeah, part of
in
like
that
the
era.
Northern Coalition, not with a
Uh,
dot, right?
no, no, no. This is long before that. So they were not part of the Northern Coalition. This is the set of alliances that I think later, like a year later, Mittani, they killed Dead Tears Titan, and then Mittani killed their alliance by stealing everything or something like that. But I wasn't playing for any of that, right? I lasted like 2 weeks, didn't get into it at all. But I did read a lot of the Scrap Heap Challenge forums
I
when those
loved Scrap
existed.
Heap. I was all over Scrap Heap. That was such an awesome form. It still exists today, apparently, but doesn't have any of the old stuff, and they
Right,
got
no, they
rebooted.
they lost all the original stuff and became Fail Heap Challenge in the early 2010s, and by that point Kugutsumin was more popular. But so anyway, didn't get into the game at that time. Went back to WoW, had actually like a semi-professional World of Warcraft career. I was the voice of BossKillers.com during Wrath of the Lich King, so really almost the heyday. Played with a guild there whose guild leader was very famous for how he would verbally abuse people, and was on the elitist jerks boards a lot. And it turned so those guys, as various people would quit World of Warcraft, they would cycle through a new MMO every year. And that was again that era everyone was trying to replicate the magic of WoW. And so in 2010, a bunch of them decided to play Eve. I'm like, hey, I know just the tiniest bit about that game. Let's do it. We got shot almost immediately going into low sec, and I looked up Goon Swarm because actually the elitist jerks people had previously been a Goon Squad splinter guild in World of Warcraft. So we had a bunch of people who were already goons and a bunch of us who were just sort of hangers on, but we'd all been posting together for about half a decade at that point. What I did not know, I had read some of the Goonswarm stories, but at that time, at that juncture, they owned two star systems in Declan. They were crashing on the couch of Tau Ceti Federation. And so we ended up being, and I didn't work this out until I think 10 years later during the Vietnam War. We were the first member corporation to join new into Goonswarm Federation. All the previous ones had come over, right? But there were not that many. So that era, it started with 30 or 40 people in fleets, and so when we trudged another 3 dozen people through the EC TAC P8R gate from Torinos, that was like magic to Goonswarm. And again, we were clueless. I knew none of this. Um,
You gotta love the
so
the feats you can pull off from being clueless in this game.
yeah, it worked out. But like, DBRB was the first FC I ever really interacted with. Now his
Great FC
career,
to
sure,
interact with
yeah,
in the
his
beginning, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I heard someone in that era describe working with DBRB as like watching Picasso before paint has been invented. He's a gaming sort of savant. Anyway, so very quickly, I ended up a paper pusher. I never learned to PvP because there was always something to do. Mittens stuck me directly into the Alliance's leadership, and that was how we operated. All of the corporate CEOs were in leadership, and ended up as the Alliance's auditor and moon spreadsheet guy as it grew and became the Deccan Coalition, and then the CFC. Every successive region we took, I was the person with the moon spreadsheets, figuring out, okay, well, the diplomats want this to happen, and what is actually plausible? What do the numbers look like? Is everyone making the right amount of money, and so on? And that whole Technetium era was the heart of my career, trying to build super caps and not get shot by Pandemic Legion, which we were ultimately pretty successful at. Right, there are a number of my corporation members on the BTAC R5 battle report in their super carriers and Titans, which we had built by that point. And so yeah, and then I was space fired for inactivity in like mid 2015, but had been inactive really for almost 2 years at that point.
And that's inactive in any kind of like no leadership, no nothing.
I mean, officially I was still in leadership, and that's how I got space fired. Right, they cut me off. We're like, you're not actually doing.
You're not leading.
Yeah, exactly.
Was your corporation still running at that point pretty strong at that point, or?
I wouldn't say strong. We merged back into Goons around that time because it was not sustained as its own thing, right? There was no more. Even by that point, the Elitist Jerks forums themselves were gone. That community had migrated to a different set of forums, and it wasn't the WoW source was not there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that is all merged in. We kept some of our assets around, and in fact, some people did play who I knew very well and were highly trusted. Yeah, through the casino war, I wasn't around for that, but so a bunch of our stuff got hauled to Delve in the end. And so it was there when in 2020, the horn went off, and the horn actually didn't work on me. I was too powerful, right? Mittens had to personally intervene to resurrect me and say, hey, we need help. And I had previously been telling another gal who was in leadership all that time, that sort of missing period of my career, a bunch of my friends, including a couple of coworkers, were still very active in Goonswarm. And I told her, look, I cannot imagine anything I want less than to come back to the full space politics and be button heads with Mittani every day. I was not into that idea at all. So it took a little doing. But there turned out to be quite a lot to do. And then, so, I got back into it right after the NPC Delve Keepstar kills during that war, if that timeline is familiar. There was the point where Pappy breaches into Delve and puts down those Keepstars, and we kill several of them before sort of deciding that was not a play that was worth it to keep repeating. And then when the M2 Tech XFE Titan fight rolled up, was basically in charge of the mobilization that happened right after the armor timer. So if you're listening and you're not familiar, at the armor timer, a lot of Pappy's ships were trapped in space, and we tried to keep them there. They didn't log back on after downtime, and in the intervening 72 hours, me and the new finance team that I had finished promoting about a month before that, did all the arrangements and essentially purchased a ton of Titan hulls, some of them on credit, in order to SRP the entire Titan armada before the hull timer on the Saturday, right? So the armor timer was a Wednesday night. It was New Year's Eve, as I recall. And it melted my computer, as a matter of fact. I was still running on a 2012 CPU and graphics card. That did not work. But that intervening period was really where we remobilized and rearmed the whole Super Capital Armada, replaced a number of Titans for allies even. Meanwhile, PanFam, they had made a ton of noise about, oh, we have this cache of 100 Titans and we're ready to replace anything. But it turns out that half of them were not on site. And so we observed people like Pandemic Legion hauling Titans down from Owasso on a jump chain that really took them the entire time, and that's ultimately a big part of why they were late to the hull timer and had to jump in with us already assembled, which didn't work for them, or for CCP, as a matter of fact. So yeah, subsequently was involved in rebuilding, but was actually really exhausted after the war. So I take at least some blame for how that went. There was a lot of senior leadership that were just tired out. but it took another almost year before that sort of culminated and Mittens got his ass canceled.
Hmm.
But at that point, I said, well, obviously I'm sticking around now. The Imperium has to survive. And that the people who canceled him branded me on the. I went on Talking in Stations right around that time, right after he had stepped down and talked about everything. They branded me with the title of Malkador, which is a 40k reference that refers to the Emperor's greatest servant in Warhammer 40k. So I just felt deeply honored to be blessed with that accolade by people who hated me at that point. So yeah, it's been a cool couple of years since. I had just gotten onto the CSM at that point. Mittens put me on there before all of that went down, but it was only a month prior to him then stepping down. And I've been largely engaged with CSM stuff for the past couple of years. I was on 17 and 18, and I'm running again.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like you have a lot of experience with leadership. Like, it sounds like you kind of dabbled your toes into this, and then you saw that there was a diving board, and you were like, "Oh, I can jump off that."
Yeah, it was an accident, right? My parents' accountant. So after a while, I was trying to assemble a normal career, work for my parents' logistics business for a minute. Logistics here meaning transportation in real life. They were a freight broker, and their accountant taught me to use a pivot table, and that was the secret sauce of doing. Like I said, I became auditor and helped figure out where all the alliance's money was going, and so we had a quite advanced operation very early. I was also there for what I guess was the invention of SRP as a wide-scale whole alliance thing. I actually remember it like it was yesterday. Mitten saying, "I've always wanted to do this," and talking about how we were going to SRP standard main fleet losses, reimbursement we called it. And my part in that project, so again, I didn't invent that, I was just there. But my part in the project was to gift every member of the Alliance an Alpha Fleet Maelstrom for Christmas in 2010, because I was running the jump freight program. So hauled them all out to Declan from Jita. Only a few jumps at that time, no jump fatigue, wasn't so bad. But am just delighted now to go back and realize that before that, those programs didn't exist, and now it's basically standard, right? It raised the competition level in nullsec especially. So yeah, some history, and since I've never gotten good at PvP, I just keep going back to the paper pushing like a dog to my vomit, I guess. Maybe in my third career, I'll make it out there to faction warfare or something and actually learn how to click my buttons fast enough.
So yeah, what is some of the stuff that, so it sounds like you got really entrenched in the out-of-game stuff of EVE Online, all the spreadsheets in space that people, I feel like people misunderstand. They're like, oh, it looks like spreadsheets in space. It's like, no, this game is played in actual Excel. Like, that's where a large portion of people spend almost all their time, or it's also a chat room, and just a communication device. What are some of the stuff that you did do in outer space that you really enjoy back in the day and like today?
So my principal job in the original career was running the jump freight service. That was something that my corp actually invented. I had a bunch of people from World of Warcraft who were loyal to not really me specifically. I just had ended up I was the person who knew anything about EVE at the start, but they were loyal to each other, and they would never, not a single one of them ever screwed us over. And so I had people running jump freight with huge contracts. Collateral wasn't even a thing yet. I mean, it was in the game, but we didn't use it. And still nothing ever got stolen.
Wow.
So the 8-lane super highway of war material stretching, not just to Declan, but like I mentioned, the CFC went on this whole campaign of conquering region after region after region, and we were staged practically everywhere. So that's the majority of my shift time, and I'm actually very proud of my one jump freight corporation not having a jump freighter loss mail on it anywhere.
Wow, that's impressive.
Although you can go look at it and you'll see they're just infinite pages and pages and pages of Heron sinos from 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. So there are loss mails, right? I got hot dropped by PanFam in Packinen just once. Of course, it was useless. I docked, right? It's very simple mechanics, actually. But plenty of jump freighters die, and I'm happy. I did end up losing one in Delve years later that I had forgotten to dock thanks to intoxication. I came back and everyone was linking me a lost mail, but that wasn't in the jump freight corps.
That reminds me of when I was in Interstellar Alcoholic Conglomerate back in like 2007. I can't remember who it was, but there was a guy who'd always fly his Knicks around and was well known for being intoxicated, who fell asleep outside the station, not at a POTS, outside the station. Can't dock, and also didn't matter because he wasn't at the keyboard.
Yeah.
And we had like a 24-hour, well, it was like, I think like an 8-hour like patrol fleet that we just had sitting on top of a Knicks, just wondering when somebody was going to realize there was a Knicks, and nobody did. Somehow Outbreak didn't find out, Coalition didn't find it didn't leak. That was the big thing, because I mean, obviously we're all a bunch of drunkards. There's probably like 20 of us are spies. How is there not somebody? And apparently there wasn't. And, yeah, intoxication will get you blown up real easy in EVE Online.
Yeah.
But I
So
really.
I guess,
Oh, go ahead.
I want to say beyond that, I guess I've been super engaged more even this time than in my previous career with the industry stuff, especially in the wake of the industry changes. There has been such a lack of people with the will or desire to engage with the new complexity, and at some point I said I have to figure this out myself, and I did, and built many hundreds of capitals and probably half a dozen titans earlier, really at the beginning of this year, the end of last year.
Oh wow! Even at the prices that they're at right now.
You can go back to the battle report and see we lost the majority of them in those pair of Abazon fights, or however many there were. There might have even been 3 up in Losec. But yeah, that was really informative. Let me give a lot better feedback to CCP because I think there's a lot that needs to happen there in terms of just simplifying, and I've tried to. This is a difficult point for them to accept, but I've made the point a number of times that going through a huge proliferation era and then going to arms control really has just resulted in everyone using their super capitals like nukes, which is not, or as a deterrent,
Right. Yeah, it's not quite the mutual assured destruction, but it's like these things are like they're ungodly expensive, and yeah, and we can't wipe out all of EVE with it, but we can make ourselves ungodly poor, for poorer if we start throwing these things around without the easy. Because the big problem is the industrial changes to remake them. It's not just that it's more costly. It's that it's vastly more complex on an industrial level to build these things. Whereas before it was like minerals and like a few odd items, right? I mean, basically to build all the items you didn't have to have a lot of different crazy items. You just had to have a lot of the normal base items to make other items to make the ship, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, it's more complex, and there are various bottlenecks that are troublesome in a situation where even someone did have, say, 10 or 20 trillion ISK and wanted to invest it into a new super capital fleet. How quickly can they even do that with how some of the bottlenecks are structured? And I just think that's terrible, right? I understand why they went that way, because it doesn't make sense for capitals to just be Tech 1 minerals in that way.
Right, yeah, I agree with that.
I back that, right? And I've told them that. And it will, if they can get the simplification to a point, and the combination of bottlenecks and price point and all of this, and their power level, we'll come back to that in a second, to the point where people want to build them at scale and will do it and will try and replace them and will use them, and there's stuff to do. Having them linked with the whole rest of the economy instead of just minerals is great, potentially, right? That is the thing that drives the EVE economy to expand. And if you go to the charts and see how few capitals have been built in the intervening 3 years, you can see where the missing juice is that used to just be the engine that would keep the economy going, because the outsized numbers on them are really what keeps people buying stuff other than Plex, so to speak. And now it's largely subcaps and faction ships and expensive stuff, and it's not the same as it previously was. So and like I mentioned just now, game balance is part of this, right? So my partner for this year, Zinta Janaka, is basically Goonswarm's Master of War, Sky Vice Marshal, whatever you want to call him. And he drew a lot of aggro, especially from Losec in his initial post, because just one of the paragraphs was about him thinking that long-range dreads are too strong, and because they can, without very much effort, they can track a battle cruiser or a battleship, is his argument. And so he got a lot of flack, whatever. I'm not here to support that specific point necessarily, but more to say, like, in a broader context, it is obvious that dreads have overpowered the rest of the capital meta. Carriers
Absolutely.
feel like no one knows that's their role. No one is using supers because the Navy dreads are too dangerous, and the only real change that has been made, and of course Surgical Strike plays into this too, but I guess they upped the Titan Doomsday damage, which,
Mhm.
okay, cool. Now maybe it can kill a capital again. But there's a wider meta and balancing problem. PvE content plays into this too, right? They got rid of stuff like boson ratting, and even the crab beacons that everyone can use are not very inviting to use your fighter bombers on, because what
Mhm.
can you hit with them? What can you hit with the Titan guns? It's just not, it's not there, and so there's this whole array of things that I wish for them to fix.
Yeah, I really like the idea of getting more supers into outer space with content for them because, I used to super rat back when I was in Imperium. I had a lot of fun doing super ratting, and if there was specific content to supers, I would have put my super out a lot more, especially at the price point of, like, I don't know, it was like 15 billion that I got my haul at back then. Um,
Yeah, sure. That, of
and
course, that factors into it too. And I don't think we're going back there, but inflation has been such that I think you could see a world where if they drop even a little in price, that people would put a 45 or a 50 billion ISK super carrier on the field if there's something to do with it, right? If
right.
even if it is they can only clear these couple sites that pop up a day, but the sites have whatever POS towers or capital sized rats that drop reasonable loot but have capital level EHP that you want cap guns, not Haws or fighter bombers to get through. That's potentially interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to
We'll
see
see if they
like
can
also
ramp
like
that.
a structure maybe that sits cloaked in space until a Titan's been sitting there for like a minute or whatever, and then you got to doomsday it. It's got the regeneration that only a doomsday can take care
Yeah.
of, or an insane amount of dreads, which one person to do PVE content or 60. A lot easier to just get one person to go like, okay, I'll go risk a Titan for 2 minutes, or whatever, how long they need to stay on grid after that doomsday and
Hmm.
stay on grid to get it to pop or something. But yeah, it'd be cool if there was some for 0.0 to really be like. That's the other thing. Like they've taken away the Roy Kuehl for really a good. It used to be all over the place in the sense that it was one of the best miners, so that therefore you
Hmm.
really wanted to have that thing in outer space. It was OP for sure, and
Hmm.
needed to be nerfed. Was multiple time nerfed before full
Yeah.
scarcity hit. But I remember Roy Kuehl hunting was like a thing, man. Like, oh, that was so fun. Like that, you just go out, you get a hunter team together, and they were just all over the place. And yeah, 20, maybe 50% of them were protected by the super umbrella, and
Hmm.
even ones under the super umbrella, you could still hit because half of them were idiots. They're just figuring
Right.
it out. Like, I'm tackled in my Roy Kuehl. Like, where? What? Like,
It's
they're
never
killing
happened to
me.
them. Sure. Yeah, and I mean, so there's been a lot of debate. I know there are a lot of people, maybe not even listening, but people have complained vociferously about the Surgical Strike patch, for example. But that patch was directly targeted at all the stuff that players hated at the time. No one liked the game where 50 carriers could kill any subcap fleet or any 5 subcap fleets. No one liked the strength of the umbrellas, and CCP reacted to that. And now, whoops, everyone's malding about that now for a couple of years. So you got to be careful with player feedback. Sometimes they'll give you what you want.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, that's the thing is, there's always going to be complaints. There's never a world where you can come out and put out something, change something in a game where everybody says it's a resounding success. But you do have levels of success. I would say like the faction warfare um, patch that they put out a couple of years ago to bring front lines to completely overhaul, and also created one of the best maps, which we have on the screen just below us in EVE Online. Inside the game, there is no better map than the faction warfare map, and no worse map than the pirate faction warfare map. And I can't believe that they went so diametrically opposed on those maps.
Mm.
But yes, overall, the patch itself was beautiful. Like, upgraded a lot. There was still stuff to bitch about, still stuff
Mhm.
to tweak here and there. There's still stuff to tweak a lot. But the overall, like, what did you do to transform faction warfare was surprisingly very well received for a player base that hates change on a radical scale.
Yes, they do. They really do.
And this
Um,
recent patch for 0.0, I felt like had the potential to do the same. And I think one of the worst, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, it feels like one of the worst implementations on this isn't necessarily the concept or idea behind what they're doing, like the overall reshaping of how sovereignty and what it means to own a system, power, workforce, all this stuff, upgrading your systems coming from around your system, but the numbers itself is what, like how like once you got to see the final product, you're like, oh, this is
whoops.
downgrading all of our space. Whereas all of faction warfare felt like we got upgraded, like we were
Right.
like, oh, okay, so now we're back in the fight for a place for people to want to live. And it feels
Yeah.
like 0.0 was kind of floundering to a certain degree, and then it was told, here's a lifeline, by the way, it's an anchor.
Yeah, that's more or less the case, and of course that's directly traceable to the Rorqual experience and how they fear the possible output of nullsec if it is unchained at all. It feels like, and so that's been a big struggle. But yeah, the fundamentals are actually very sound. So right after getting on CSM 17, like I said, Min's got his ass canceled. And in fact, a ton of people made fun of me for not having a kill board. It's not my main, right? But my Kazanir character had literally 0 kills because, of course, actually in 2007, you were locked into your character stats based on your bloodline and
Mm-hmm.
race. And
Yep.
so I immediately re-rolled a Brutor character, and have never really used Kazanir for anything. He has a few million skill points, so he can light a Sino, you know. But I realized, so being made fun of, whatever. Obviously, I have my job. I could retire from the CSM thing and work for Goons for another 10 years if I wanted. But I said to myself, I would be very upset if any of these clowns turned out to be correct, and if I screwed up something on the CSM that would impact the game poorly. So I went on a whole vision quest and read all of the patch notes, but not in order. I did it in reverse order, like my mythological hero Merlin, aging in reverse. I started at the current right before Uprising and went all the way back and had to dig some of them out of the Wayback Machine. And I got to the beginning, not quite the beginning. There's 2 before this, but I got to the first true expansion pack. So the first 2 releases are Castor, the Simon and Schuster release, and then Second Genesis, the online re-release after Simon and Schuster goes out of business in 2003. So the first real expansion pack is called Exodus, and there in the Exodus patch notes, in all its frickin' glory, is the moon system. Pass, moons, Moongu and reactions, uh, all the Tech 2 stuff, right? The addition of Tech 2 to the power curve happens very, very early.
Mm-hmm.
It's all right there, and that was like, I felt the moment that Bob revealed to me the way that the universe should be and how things had gotten screwed up. Which is really that this element of being able to conquer something and hold it for money, even if you can't grab the much maligned passive income topic,
Mm-hmm.
was part of the fundamentals. And of course, I grew up with that. And then for many years, there were a bunch of goons who more or less campaigned against it or thought it was crappy. But I realized in sort of that visionary moment that you have to have both intention with one another. And I went and did some math, and you can work this out. I have a post somewhere that does some basic set theory. I went to college for mathematics, right? And you can easily work out that there really are 3 super archetypes of players in the game if you look at how Eve is broken down, right? You think about Eve, what are the basic actions you can take? Well, there's PvE, right? You're exploiting some celestial resource to make money or get resources. And then there's PvP, which is some contest of some kind with other players,
Yeah,
right?
you can get resources from to a certain degree too, and would you consider market PvP on that PvP?
Well, yes, absolutely. So, and I have made the point repeatedly that any contest qualifies, and that's why I think that, and we'll get to this, PvP is really required. With the exception of Abyssals, which there's no instance content in the game. Even in high sec, all of these resources are under some competitive pressure, either just from other players. Still, you can get shot in high sec. You can't get away from PvP. So then I said, okay, well, what is after that? And it turns out that this is Exodus, invented a 3rd type of thing, which is really unlike the 2 atomic activities of PvP and PvE. And the 3rd thing is capture. And what capture does is take both of those atomic activities and projects them across the arrow of time to some future point, usually defined by a timer, a vuln window, whatever it is. And it says, okay, until that time, the owner who captured it, they're the only ones who have access to the resource. And then the PvP itself is delayed, right? It takes all the PvP people might want to do and says, instead, I'm inviting you to PvP at this particular time, right? There's going to be a contest you've anteed up. And so that is the third thing. Okay, now you do your set theory and combine those, and you can say, okay, you'll have players who will PvE and they'll capture space, right? This is almost the traditional, the empire builders. I call them settlers.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they're required to PvP. Everyone is. But then you can take one of the other two out. You can say there are people who will PvE, but they don't want to capture space, right? And of course, they'll PvP. I call these Team Raider. Because they're not owning the space. They're whatever they're doing, they don't want to sit there and hold it. They'll fight you, they'll come hunt you, but their interaction is fundamentally to try and prey on the space holders or the crabs in some way. And then the third one is the people who just don't want to crab. They will absolutely PvP, and to get more PvP, they'll absolutely hold space. They'll go through the drudge work, the rigmarole, and also that's how they make a lot of their money. They just don't want to crab. And those are your three combinations. Those are the only three there are. As soon as you say PvP is required, that's your axiom, and the rest falls into place. But that third group, I call them Conqueror. I think Setao in his CSM campaign post called them Team Mercenary, which also fits because they might come and conquer space on a contract just for a while. But they're still holding the space. They're taking it from the people who are there. They have to be able to make money. It has to be worth it for them, right? EVE is just simulating human motivation. You can't force players to do things. You have to motivate them into it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what I mentioned, the term passive income, which I hate, right? I prefer to call it conquest income. Another popular term of CCP is contested income. But it has to be something that is not dependent on the number of crab hours that you invest. And so I've been telling them 2 years long, this is what you need to do. You need to rebuild a complete suite of mechanics for really like a metaphorical version of Moonswarm's worst enemies, right? I grew up fighting Pandemic Legion, and that's what they did. They held moons. That needs to have full flower, or otherwise the universe is always going to be out of balance somehow. And when it is, you'll reach some sort of stagnant point.
Which we've been at for, 4 years now almost?
Depends on how you count, I think. And honestly, the game previously has also been at stagnant points, so I want to address it a little bit. Because even with the moon system, what was going on the first however many years of the game, really all the way till Lifeblood in 2018, but changing over time, is that moons, with being linked to Tech 2, and with Tech 2 being so important to the power curve, even in high-sec, right? High-sec missions, there were some you couldn't complete unless you had Tech 2 mods on your ship, right? The power creep had not happened as much. And so Tech 2 was so important that moons just dominated the null-sex value. And so when you saw the invention of renting around 2005 or 6 by Dianabolic and Band of Brothers, and all renting is doing is stuffing a bunch of crab mechanics into a trench coat and calling it passive income, because for the landlord, it is passive income, right? They get their static amount, and they don't have to think about it too hard. That's a very valid set of player relationships. There are tons of different groups of players for whom that is the right, they either want to rent or want to be renting out their space because they don't want to use it. But if it's the only thing available, you still end up with a potential of a sort of stagnant Nash equilibrium emerging in the game, because eventually, just like you will run out of crabs yourself or run out of player time, so will the renters, right? It says if you have to become a landlord to do this, space lord, whatever, then ultimately you're still subject to the total number of players playing EVE and their total time invested, and that means that your map can get out of whack, right? From the perspective of the map, of the space, passive income is the most active. It's always on, all the time, no matter if someone's not there, it's printing a certain amount of money. But this is actually the protection for CCP2. I mentioned they're afraid of what nullsec can do. But if it were a static amount of stuff that nullsec were producing, of course they wouldn't be afraid. They would just know, right?
Right.
And some sort of tension between those needs to be established, and they really need to be competing against each other, settler and conqueror, over everything, right? Over time, the power curve got worse and worse. There was more and more power creep, and Dominion, starting with Dominion, they introduced more and more powerful crab stuff to nullsec, and that's sort of how nullsec is understood now, is these infinitely repopping sites from upgrades that you can install. That was only added in late 2009.
Yep. No, I remember I was a belt ratter, man, for a long time in my
yeah,
life.
I know how to chain belts too. Yeah.
Yep.
That made moons less and less powerful until they finally stabbed him back with lifeblood and with fracture moons. There's no way to get back to just that level of any one thing, and so what I've been telling them is they need Sov itself, basically any celestial, to be exploitable in either fashion, either by crabs or just because you're the holder at whatever that discount is. So they brought back passive moons in a sense with Metnox,
Mm-hmm.
and I view those as like the gateway drug now to this gameplay style. But they need to get there for Sov, and the problem was before Equinox you just couldn't. The only map that nullsec had was the TrueSec map,
Mm-hmm.
which is not like, what are you going to do with that, right? Pay a certain amount of ISK for the TrueSec? It just doesn't make sense. So what I am just overjoyed about with Equinox is that now there's a third map overlaid on TrueSec and overlaid on moons. There's the power and workforce map with reagent planets and all of this stuff. That is a real set of resources that, again, they've just barely managed to migrate it all the previous stuff, and no one is happy because they didn't hit the numbers and or are afraid of making them better. They're, we'll keep talking to them about that. But now the possibility exists that you could have some variety of things that allow you to forego your crab upgrades and get either better strat upgrades, better defenses, ADMs, or direct sort of contested income, right? Improved skyhook output. I don't know. There's many possibilities for your power and workforce, again, by foregoing the crab stuff, and that the space would look different, and that a different whole set of players would be interested in doing that. Because right now, the Sov is only worth taking if you know you're going to get to live there for at least a couple months, let's say, very, very generously, and usually longer, right? That is a huge problem because it limits the set of players interested in taking +1 system to just those people who know that they can stay there, they can invest the necessary stuff, they can play Team Settler.
Mm-hmm.
Team Conqueror, Team Mercenary is just not on the table unless they fix all of that. But if they manage to fix that, if they manage to reduce the marginal cost of conquering a system to 0 and give you some type of contested income for it, king of the hill income, so to speak, rather than put your citadels down and crab your hearts out, all of a sudden the set of players interested in +1 system is every single group of players who could conceivably win the timer, right? It's almost infinite, right? I have imagined or dreamt of, I guess, a world where there are real esports teams who can come in and hold their 2 or 3 systems because they know all they need to do is win the timers on defense, and they'll make some money, and they can go back to playing the actual esports game where they all have 1,000 APM and are playing in tournaments, but they can hold those timers. That would not work in the current scenario, right? But it's not impossible for CCP to get there. So that really is Equinox to me. There's all this drama, there's all this complaining, and I fully understand. We're not happy, but they added a map, and that's what this game is about, is a conquest competition over a map, right? And so the fact that they pulled this off with Faction War, again, another type of gateway drug to show how things can go, is really makes me happy. And now nullsec has one, and we're going to see how things evolve.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I definitely see, like, I liked it almost adds, like, there's a layer more of Stellaris kind. I don't know if you're a Stellaris fan at all. But more and more Eve and Stellaris are starting to look like each other as the years have gone by, from a top level. It's like, I like to try and explain to my Stellaris friends what Eve is by being like, well, you just get to play one of the ships, but you could also make it all the way up to the president level of an empire. And then there's a bunch of other, but there's a bunch of stuff for you to do in your ship, besides the top level stuff. But it's getting, with this addition of workforce and reagents and stuff like that, it's much more of, there's a possibility of really caring about different resources in your systems and stuff. That every system has its power output. It affects the areas. It only power output only affects that system, right? You can't trade that. Workforce can be traded amongst systems.
Move between systems, yeah, and that was cool. I thought that was interesting, right? Yeah.
One thing I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on this, though, is doesn't this system, though, push out, just like in Stellaris, expansionalism is more important in this system. Owning the next door system is way more important now than it's ever been before. So why let Renter Alliance have these, like, they have these moons, and especially the planets and stuff, because I've heard now that the reagents are so easy to keep. You don't have to worry about raiders anymore. You can, basically, you're getting all this free amount of Mexilon. You can put up all these easy Mexilon drill, or not Mexilon, but the Megamatic gas. Drill. And and then the Metamax drills can be built out of, or can be fueled by this really easy. Why let a renter own that system when you can just own it? Or if they do come in, they don't really get to play that game. They can say they own that, but they're gonna have to give you all those resources over. It's just better to always own. There's no reason to stop growing in this system, because every system you add on to you adds a little bit more of access to workforce and reagent planets.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and let me first say, sometimes I need to be cynical and not believe them, but I do believe CCP when they say we are trying to revitalize nullsec. This is an arc that will stretch across multiple expansion packs, so this is not done by any means. And even the skyhook changes recently, I'm a huge fan of the basic principle, which is that rather than having these just be exposed 24/7, they instead become this forest of individual timers that all have to be defended. But as soon as we saw it and talked to people for 2 days, I immediately went to CCP and said, look, we can hit this with the nerf bat right away, pretty much, and make this less strong for the Sov holder.
Yeah, I mean, it was way more in favor of the favor of the Raider was, I give you way too strong, because I would just jump in. Seriously, I just have my one ship, my ENI, and my Cloak Deluge. I would filament in. I would find the nearest one. I would steal. I'd filament out. Both had cloaks on them, and I even had a guy in Int who was like, a cloak on an ENI? What the heck? I'm like, there's like 30 of you. Shut up. I'm going away. But yes, I'm stealing billions of ISK from randomly throughout the galaxy with very little worry at all. I mean, extending that timer, I think, would have helped. It jumping out to more systems, a constellation-wide alert kind of system I could see to stop the immediate thing. Letting somebody sleep in their alliance, would be that's perfectly allowable. But when I heard 1 day, 1 hour, I was like, damn, that's rough, that's bad. Then I heard, no, you're not understanding. It's 1 hour every 3 days. I was like, oh my god, I guess I'm never doing this again.
Well, and there's some other issues with it. What was very clear about the previous situation was that it was on a race to the bottom, and the majority of skyhook thefts were either they were just empty or you'd get like 20 million ISK. Right now, with the timer, and again, I come back to what I said, what capture does is it projects PvE and PvP across the vector of time to the future date. It ups the ante. So now, assuming the invitation works, and it doesn't really, because you have to scout them individually at the planet. They don't show up at the agency until they're live. Those suck. I want them to fix that stuff and make them easier to scout, easier to record, show up in the agency earlier. There are many options. If the invitation works, now all of a sudden the PvE was also projected across that time. If you show up to the beginning of one of those timers, you're either gonna steal a day and a half worth of full output. It's going to be almost 500 million ISK, or you're going to get a fight. One of those two things is going to happen. That's actually awesome.
Yes, and I see that potential very strongly.
Potential.
It's the potential, and my concern about it is that it knocks it unless we can get down to more small gang ownership, it knocks out any small gang contestedness of this, because if you can project your super caps or even just a moderate 300-man gang for a 0.0 alliance around with ansibles and stuff like that, if you can get around and defend, when you only have so many an hour that you need to defend, and you're going to be able to, the only way you're going to contest this is with another 300-man fleet all of a sudden. Like, you can't come in with a small group and try and raid something. You have to, this is a battle over a large amount of money, that is at hand here, basically.
Yep. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where they take that. What you mentioned about, does this drive the small groups out? And I think really the discussion we are having is secretly about the missing middle in EVE, which that's what Conquest Income is designed to support, is not necessarily that a tiny group can go into nullsec and make their way.
A 5 to 10 man group is not taking space, no matter what you basically do in this game.
Essentially, right? And if they do, it's by renting or whatever.
Or by,
the space is not desired, and that's what sucks, is the lack of desire. So in one sense, the passive income topic does change the largest group's behavior by making them want to overexpand. But you have to bait them into overextending for them to be overextended, so you can attempt to cut off the head or the tail of the snake. Meanwhile, what it needs to do is make it worth it to take space even temporarily.
And that's where I think I was, when you were talking about the temporary owning of space, I actually thought about it for a minute. I'm like, this is a good thing for skyhook, or this is a good way to make skyhooks, that kind of thing. So instead of going in and saying that you need to raid this if you're a small group, but not a medium-sized group of, like, you can field like 30-50 people type kind of thing, go grab a system for a couple of days, grab up those reagents real quick, and then dip out, like, if you can just grab that space for a short amount of time, and if people are overextending themselves, then, but the problem is how do we get to the point where actually overextension happens in EVE? I mean, we've done so much over the years to make travel harder in this game, and it still hasn't seemed to affect true projection in this game. And
yeah, I think seeing the forest there, of course, I played a lot before jump fatigue was introduced. And
yep, I that was crazy, man. I was like, you get anywhere at any time, like, that was nuts. And those were the days that nobody dropped supers around, willy-nilly. Like, a Titan was only seen during the Titan battles,
the big fights. Well, and that's because they knew that they would get murked by another very large group of super cap hammers.
You on grid for 10 minutes? Well, you just got the entirety of EVE is now have been able to jump to.
Yeah, so there's clearly things are out of whack now. Obviously, I'm not camping for jump fatigue to be removed, though, but by contrast, I think that the split is actually a very interesting thing. How it's not just that projection is powerful, it's that subcap projection is dramatically better than capital projection. Even if I have my group of 50 or 60 people, if I have been in a wormhole for a couple of years, I banked all this cash, we can buy caps and super caps, and I could hypothetically take that grip of capitals and go sit somewhere and take Sov, and probably eat a number of subcap fleets on my way to doing that. Projection is so strong now in subcap terms that you really have to probably eat like 7 or 8 fleets to be successful, and that's too high. Dramatically too high. But also at some point it becomes, okay, well, the block has to restage their own capitals to fight you, to really deal with this. And they can only do that so many times, and they can only do that in basically one place at a time, right? So I can easily see a world where if it's worth doing, if taking that constellation or region is worth doing, that people will do that. And then maybe the block does come to throw them out, but they have made a lot of money in the meantime as a penalty for the block ignoring the stuff. And meanwhile, while the block has come to throw them out, the same thing can be happening on the other edge of that block. somewhere someone else can be doing it, and over time I think this is the healing that needs to happen. I called my thread on deblockification on the forums, and it's not any one thing. It's that the motivations of a lot of different groups of players need to change. Sort of the holy grail almost is that these mechanics are strong enough that you see some group of competent capital or super capital havers depart from one of the big blocks and strike out on their own to take someone else's space, because all of a sudden that's worth doing. You know, I won't speculate here about who that might be from any of the given large groups, and of course the mechanics aren't there yet, right? None of this stuff I'm talking about essentially exists. The skyhooks do exist, but there's no exchange of power and workforce for a contested income type of thing yet. Even it sounds, and I don't know any really of the details. I in fact missed that portion of one meeting, but the mercenary dens they're talking about in the next expansion appear to hit workforce on the workforce
That's
skyhooks,
what
and
it sounds like. Yeah.
I think that's potentially really interesting. Is it passive income strictly, where it's a reward for owning the space? It doesn't sound like it, but we'll see what happens, right? And what the effect
Sounds like it's more of
is.
like you've got to, like, the mercenary den appears, gets more, and this is just barely stuff that, and so I have no idea what the hell I'm talking, but it sounds like it's like a site that kind of like builds up, and then you go do it, and there's like an activity that you'll have
Right.
to PVE your way through, and then you get some kind of reward for doing that based upon
Yeah, we'll see.
how long it's been there or something like that. So yeah, it's interesting. I'm interested to see what this kind of brings out in the expansion. But what do you think of? I think it was Phantomite who kind of brought this up. What do you think about bringing jump fatigue back to? Because there was a time when Ansible plexes gave, or jump bridges, I think were what they were called then, gave jump fatigue,
Yeah, the
and
boss jump bridge.
that smashed your ability. Like, because I remember that was something that all of a sudden you had so much more to take into account to get across your space. You know,
Yeah.
am I just doing this to try and get to high sec? Oh, not a problem. Is it possible this character will be involved in a capital brawl? Oh my god, all of a sudden this is like, so FCs and stuff were like, you know, we're not going to use this most of the time unless it's an emergency, unless there's a reason to use it, that we need to be halfway across the galaxy and we know we're not going to be jumping back into capitals. Then we're, and even then we had to be, it slowed you down quite a bit, you know.
Yeah, it did. I would say I'm not one of the put fatigue strictly onto Ansiblex like that. I think in general subcap projection should be more powerful than capital projection. I think that's fine, even though they're way apart right now. I think the way to think about Ansiblex is that forever their point has been that you as the owner can cross the borders of your space more quickly than an attacker can. That's an integral part of defense. But the trick is that in the migration to Ansiblex, previously you had POS and you had to share the password to have anyone else have access.
Yep.
But now the combination of ACLs and cross-linking of two different alliances, Ansiblex, has dramatically expanded what the definition of your space can be at really no penalty.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't make sense. So if they were if someone cropped up at CCP, for example, that said we're dedicated to giving Ansplex fatigue, that's how we're going to do it, my advice to them would be that it should be more like you can set up some portion of the network that is either much lower or limited fatigue, and you're probably spending power and workforce directly on that to decide how big is this network, and or when I change networks or for whatever reason that is a higher fatigue type of thing, because the just ACLs, like I said, they made it basically infinite. It's all of your blues. That wasn't true even in jump bridge terms. You would have to have Goonswarm, for example, set up jump bridges all throughout the CFC's space. But we had to hold those systems, and that's a whole political thing, and we had to share the password with everybody. It could be spied on, stolen, all these type of things. There were some trade-offs, and now there's just not.
Yeah, it's the interstellar superhighway that just, you know.
Yeah. Well, and that it led to real effects, right? The whole test in in late 2012, after taking Delve, had this falling out with us that was over us wanting to keep the Eye
Yes.
of Terror, our jump bridge network,
Yep.
into their space. That was the cause is not quite yet belly, but that was the breakup point, you know. So it was real, and now there's just no trade-off. So there has to be some type of trade-off. Certainly, I'm not in favor of just ditching any one of those things, right? I don't want to go back to passwords. Everyone would, I think, freak out if you said no more ACLs at all. And again, everyone would freak out if you just put standard cap fatigue onto every Ansiblix jump. That doesn't make sense, and I think does undermine the point of their existence, right? Which is that you should have your space should have an easier time crossing it where you are the defender. Now maybe that's based on like where you're staged. Maybe it's based on where your jump clone or your death clone is. I don't know. There's just a variety of options. That's important to keep, but does it need to have the strength it currently does? Of course it doesn't, right? It should actually be trivial for a group of capital havers to post up somewhere ready to invade, and for them to be able to eat the first 3 or 4 subcap fleets that come through. Those mechanics work. We've thrown battleship fleets at dreadnoughts very unsuccessfully. That works. But the fact that with a certain level of projection, it becomes easy to send actually more than they can handle, that's not good. No one actually wants that. So yeah, something needs to be changed, and it could well be that fatigue will end up being part of it. But I hope to God they see it holistically and have a more wide-ranging analysis of that set of problems. You know.
Absolutely, yeah, and I find it interesting because one of the things that I like this conversation, I'm learning a lot just listening to what you're talking about, because I'm much more on like I'm just a raider. I haven't really I've partied with leadership a lot, but I'd never my thing was not spreadsheets in space. It was
Right.
I want to see things blow up, and I love being here to help and facilitate that. But it is interesting because something about Eve is that it's really unique is that the whole thing of travel is very unique in Eve comparatively to anywhere else. If you're in World of Warcraft, you're not like, how do I get my minerals, from the mining I did or whatever, there's all I do is just transport to it. I don't even have to care about what city I am in. I just go to the auction house, maybe there's some special stuff you have to get at special cities and stuff like that, but there's nothing like that in any other game, and that's something that you got yourself expertisely into, and I may be a murderer, but I'm also a trucker, because I support my own getting stuff to my low sec and stuff like that, and using cloak hauler. I thought it was really funny when there was like a Star Trek episode where there's like a hauling ship decloaks in front of a bird of prey or a battle that's happening, and they think it's an enemy, so they blow it up, and they're like, a bunch of people in Reddit were like, why would you have a cloak on a hauling ship? And I'm like, why wouldn't you have a cloak on a hauling ship?
Guys have never played. Yeah.
that is the key to moving around, my friend, and not getting blown up. And there's just so much complexity that kind of goes into that. And then the industrial side, which is some games kind of have some industry and building of stuff like that, but our game it relies on the players. 99% of the items that are really used in this game are coming from players, and being built
absolutely.
by us. Well, not 99, but it's a huge amount of statistics made up on the spot.
It's pretty close.
So I find that you have a really great expertise in these kind of areas, and I really like what you've been kind of putting out there for what I've been seeing as you've been campaigning here. And
Thanks.
I want to make sure, though, that as we kind of get into about an hour here that we've been running, I want to make sure that we haven't missed anything else that you're really passionate about, anything that we haven't talked about yet.
I think we covered really the heart of what I am after, which is there is actually a comprehensive theory of the crime, which is that they had a great system that was never fully balanced out because then they kept adding more and more crab mechanics without balancing them by making them passively exploitable, and it worked for the longest time because moons were so dominant. But ultimately what needs to happen is that it really should be any given celestial that you can capture, that you can conquer, it needs to have an option to crab it, right? To invest a bunch of hours and make your money that way if you can figure out how to live there. But equally, you shouldn't have to do that. You should just be able to play King of the Hill, like you mentioned, Stellaris style, and that needs to be a functional pathway for the small group, for the mid-scale group, for the scaling up group, and for the big block. The only way that there is not going to be stagnancy is if the set of players interested in capturing +1 system or +1 moon is really everyone, right? You don't want it to be limited. You want to be inviting every single type of group to take all of those systems as often as they can. And if they manage to do that, those groups are all so different, and their motivations so different, and their styles so different, that you will not be able to find any one stagnant point. Someone of a different play style or a different size will always be able to come in and say, this will be worth more to me than those lazy fuckers over there who are not doing the right thing, and they will try to overthrow them. Right now, the barrier to entry is just too high, and the rewards are too low. And I don't mean crab rewards,
Right, no, and that's a really good point. And that's something that I've been lacking, that kind of thought process, I think, when thinking about some of this stuff. And it's really good to have that kind of, you need to remember that there's a whole thing behind owning space, and if you can make it actually accessible for a short period of time to get something out of it, then my God, we could harass the big blocks a lot more from all angles, and you don't have to work together. That's the beautiful part. Coordinated attack is a good thing, and if you want to take that empire over, you want to ruin them and destroy them, then you need to have like coordinated effort. Uncoordinated effort by pirates has always been extremely useful tactic that you can't fight on all ends against all these little groups that are messing with us. We're gonna have to fall back to a more strategical, put up the wall and put the barriers down. And as long as you can't project all over the place and just be everywhere at once, then you're gonna have, and even at that point, you do have some fatigue, just natural, like. They just keep on coming. Like, it just.
Yeah, the current stuff is very powerful, but yeah, of course, overextension is possible even in this universe. But often the blocks don't do it because there's not necessarily a reason to. Even the big blocks will run out of crabs for the 4th or the 5th region a lot of the time, right? And I'm glad that the Goon Swarm's move has been announced now. Because there was a few months where everyone was saying, oh, look, this is all about Equinox, and they're just taking this space because CCP has said they need more, and this is all awful. And I tried to tell people, don't take the Imperium's move as a judgment purely on Equinox. It's not like that. What we wanted to do is be at the front, and in a way, we've called this the floodplains doctrine for the longest time, and in a way, we're finally being able to get away from that, which I think is good. But the fact that for the longest time we could treat each +1 region as a floodplain that ultimately didn't matter if we had to fall back, that's not good for the game, right?
Yep.
It should, in any time we lost one of those floodplains, it should have mattered, and often it did not. And if we can get them to overthrow that and make it so that the first couple weeks are dramatically more meaningful, that they cost less, and that they reward the victor more, then the reward also plays into the size topic, right? That's how the missing middle can regrow, is by taking that small or semi-small or sort of low medium sized group and rewarding them with money. How else are they going to build their own capitals and super capitals and grow up, right? And that's how it needs to be done. So
Awesome. Yeah, no, I fully agree. And so one thing else I want to make sure we have some time here for is if you have any shout outs that you want to give, if there's anybody that's mentored you, anybody that, has worked alongside with you, your mom and dad that I'm sure are watching this, anybody that you want to give shout outs to.
I hope she's not watching. I try not to swear still. I grew up Mormon. I have just the most fantastic parents on the face of the planet, as a matter of fact. I will shout them out. They're recently retired, which my whole family was overjoyed by, that they managed to pull that off and are not working the rest of their lives. No, in Eve terms, I'm super happy. I say practically once a week I love working here. The Imperium's leadership team that has been successful at maintaining the Imperium and helping us how to figure out how to be ourselves again after the events of a couple years ago. I just couldn't be happier with this move. Has been planned for a long time. Now we're in the middle of it, and I'm excited to see what the future holds. In CSM terms, pursuant to what we talked about, I have been working a lot on talking to a couple of different low-sec folks. A couple of the ones I invited to run had to decline for real-life reasons, which is too bad. But I anticipate that you're going to see people like Setout in particular from Deepwater Hooligans on the Imperium ballot directly. I tried to get all of the nullsec blocks to endorse a couple of lowsec people for this reason, because I think that fundamentally, especially once they're at a certain size, those guys, even if they're temporarily hiding out in lowsec or in NPC nullsec, they belong to the map game, right? Deepwater Hooligans does not belong to faction warfare. They're grown up. They belong to the end game. But we have to get champions in front of CCP that can make the case directly, and Setout has done a great job of that in his thread with it, talking about the mercenary playstyle. It has to be them actually campaigning for their own mechanics instead of just me, Goonswarm CFO, going, you have to rebuild my enemy's hypothetical best, right? That got us pretty far. I'll take some credit, because when I showed up on CSM 17, that the whole topic had been just highly partisanized in a way that was not healthy, and I hope I managed to unwind at least some of that. But because the playstyle has been, in a sense, dead for so long, it is not well represented, and so I'm hopeful for that to change this year. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I really like Young Puke. I think that he's a great, leader for the small sec alliances and stuff like that. They're no longer part of the Galente Federation, but they do, they have still got enlistment inside of us, and I believe the Angels is what they allow. And we had a lot of fun with them, like not this last Wednesday, but a week ago before I went to Vegas. Like I had a really good brawl out with them in Hain, where they threw a few faction battleships at us. They had like 6 or so, and we had like a gang of 15 that we'd met with them here and there, and they actually came in on us, and after they had wiped out one of our fleets that was just fucking around, and so we'd gotten into a big brawl. It was awesome. We got a bunch of cool kills from them, and it was like, God, you guys got balls. I love that. Like, yes, people who come in on you, like they go fight. I've been in a lot of Young Puke fleets before he left Galamill and stuff like that. I think that there's a lot to be said for bringing in the low sec point of view into the CSM, and because I think there's a lot to be said about low sec, and I'm a low sec candidate and a pirate and also faction warfare, and this is probably our best shot, even though I'm running, but I know, unless I can really pull together a bunch of people that have never voted before, which is also something I'm hoping to do, but I think that Young Puke is a really good shot for us to have low sec representation, and I'm glad to hear he's gonna be on the Imperium ballot.
Yeah, I've had great conversations with him, and I felt like he immediately got what I was talking about. So I'm excited for whoever we can bring. Right, like I mentioned, CCP practically asked me for champions, asked the current CSM for champions as we were discussing Equinox. So I would love to get the right people in the door. We'll see how it goes.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on. How can we get a hold of you? Do you do YouTube, Twitch, Twitter? What are the ways of contacting you, or is there any way to see what your platform is more in depth about what you're trying to do here?
I am Kazanir everywhere. So if you look on Reddit, you'll find actually my previous year's CSM 18 post. I put up the actual goonfleet.com post, which discusses these topics in great depth for an audience of goons. Same thing with my forums thread. So this is everything we've talked about is really on there in some way. I'd invite people to check it out. But feel free to hit me up on Discord, but if you go to like facebook.com/Kazanir, you'll see a picture of me when I'm 7. If you go to my Twitter, you're going to see complaining about USA politics, so don't do that unless you really know what you want. It's in the profile. But I'm honestly easy to find if you need something. I have taken calls from random people that I don't even know during the last couple CSM terms, and I'm happy to chat about whatever. I love talking about EVE Online. So anyway, thanks so much for your time, man.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's been an honor, and good luck. I have a feeling that you might get on to the CSM this year, but you never know. You never know with there's a lot of votes out there that are uncounted. Many years. This is the player turnout in this game of voting is really low, and I think we would have a big difference in CSM if there was majority of people, like even above the 60% mark. You'd have a drastically different CSM.
Possible. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. I mean,
Awesome.
last year was high turnout. We'll see if this year can be even better.
Absolutely.
Yep. Thanks again for your time, man.
Yeah, have a good one. And thank you all for watching. Thank you all for listening. And have a great day.
Bye, everybody.